Imagine stepping onto a Viking ship. The wind is already cutting through your clothes. Cold spray hits your face. Your hands are getting stiff. And there is nowhere to hide. No heated cabin. No engine room. No modern waterproof jacket. Just a wooden ship and the North Atlantic. So how did Viking sailors survive? The first answer is simple. They prepared for the cold before leaving shore. Viking clothing was built from materials they could produce themselves, especially wool. Archaeological evidence shows that wool and flax were important materials for Viking Age clothing. Wool was extremely useful. It trapped air around the body. That helped slow heat loss. And it could still provide insulation when slightly damp. A typical sailor might wear several layers: a tunic, trousers, a cloak, and additional coverings when the weather became worse. Some wealthy Viking garments even included fur linings. But staying warm was not just about having thick clothes. The fit mattered too. Loose openings could let cold wind rush inside, so clothing had to cover the body well. Cloaks could be fastened around the shoulders. Hoods or head coverings protected the head. Footwear protected the feet. And small details could make a huge difference. Because on a cold ship, your hands and feet are often the first things to become useless. Imagine trying to pull a rope with fingers that barely move, or steer a ship with numb hands. Cold could turn simple work into a serious problem. And then came the water. That was even worse. Rain, sea spray, wet ropes, wet wooden boards. Everything could soak through clothing. So keeping clothing dry was almost as important as owning warm clothing. The Vikings had another advantage. They were surrounded by other people. A crowded ship meant less privacy, but it also meant shared warmth. People could sit close together, rest beside one another, and reduce their exposure to the wind. The ship itself offered some protection too. Its wooden sides blocked part of the wind and spray. When sailors were not rowing or handling the sail, they could stay lower inside the hull. But there was one thing the ship could not provide: a permanent, warm room. And that meant the crew needed another strategy. They had to keep moving. Rowing, pulling ropes, handling the sail, steering, bailing water. Every hard task required energy, and that energy produced heat. So the Viking ship was never truly comfortable. It was a survival system. Clothing, movement, food, shelter, and teamwork, all working together. Because the Vikings did not conquer the cold. They learned how to manage it. And their most important weapon against the freezing sea was something they carried on their bodies: wool. But wool alone was not enough. The real enemy was water, rain, sea spray, wet ropes, and cold wooden boards beneath your feet. Once your clothing became soaked, staying warm became much harder. So Viking sailors had to protect their clothing as carefully as their bodies. They used woolen garments, cloaks, and leg coverings. Some waterproof clothing was also made from treated animal skins, and their clothing was not just for appearance. It was survival equipment. Imagine trying to pull a heavy rope while your hands are numb, or standing for hours with wet feet inside cold leather shoes. Small things could become serious problems. That is why head coverings mattered. So did socks. So did leg wrappings. So did good footwear. The goal was simple: keep the warm air close to the body and keep the cold wind outside. But the ship itself offered another layer of protection. A longship had raised wooden sides. They blocked some wind and spray. When sailors were not working, they could stay lower inside the hull. They could sit close together. They could use cargo and equipment as extra barriers. And then there was something even simpler: other people. A crowded crew meant bodies were packed close together. That did not make the ship comfortable, but it reduced exposure. 30 people working together could also create a surprising amount of heat, especially when they were rowing. Rowing was exhausting, but it also made the body produce heat. Pull, release, pull again. The muscles kept working, and the body's internal furnace stayed active. But eventually, the crew had to rest, and that created another problem. Because once you stopped working, the cold came back. This is where food became critical. A cold body needs energy. A tired sailor needs even more. Viking crews carried foods that could survive long journeys: dried fish, preserved meat, bread, grain products, dairy foods, and other stored provisions. The exact menu depended on the region and voyage, but the purpose was always the same: give the body fuel. Fat was especially valuable. It contains far more energy per gram than protein or carbohydrates. so fatty foods could provide a lot of energy without taking up enormous amounts of storage space. And that mattered on a crowded ship. There was no refrigerator, no supermarket, no emergency delivery. Everything had to be planned before departure. Food, water, clothing, ropes, sails, tools, everything. Because once the ship disappeared over the horizon, for days, the crew might have only what they had brought with them. And there was another problem. Sleep. A sailor could not simply climb into a warm bed. The ship was moving beneath him. The wind was blowing. The sea was cold. And everyone around him was trying to survive too. So rest had to happen wherever the ship allowed it. Sometimes wrapped in wool. Sometimes beside another crew member. Sometimes with the ship still moving beneath them. And when conditions became too dangerous, there was one place that was always better than the ship: land. A beach could provide something the longship could not: fire, dry ground, food preparation, a place to dry clothing, and most importantly, a chance to finally escape the wind. Because the smartest Viking survival trick was not fighting the cold, it was knowing when to get away from it. But sometimes, the weather changed without warning. The wind became stronger, rain began falling, waves climbed over the sides of the ship, and suddenly, the same open boat that carried the crew across the sea became a trap. A Viking sailor had very few options. There was no radio, no weather app, no emergency beacon, and certainly no rescue helicopter. If someone fell into the water, the situation could become deadly very quickly. Cold seawater pulls heat from the body much faster than cold air, and heavy clothing becomes a serious problem. It becomes soaked. It becomes heavy. Swimming becomes harder. So the crew had one priority: stay aboard. That meant teamwork. Someone had to steer. Someone had to control the sail. Others had to pull ropes. And someone had to remove water from the hull. Because a wooden ship could not simply be ignored. Water had to be dealt with again and again. And the people doing that work were already cold, already tired, already wet. This is why Viking survival was never about one tough warrior. It was about the entire crew. One person worked, another rested. Then they switched. The ship kept moving. The work continued. And the body kept producing heat. But eventually, everyone needed rest. That created another danger: sleep. Imagine lying down after hours at sea. Your clothes are damp. The wind is still blowing. The wooden boards beneath you are cold, and there is no warm bedroom waiting below. You wrap yourself in wool. You squeeze into whatever protected space the ship provides, and you try to sleep. But the sea keeps moving. The cold never stops. So dry bedding became extremely valuable. The Oseberg ship burial, dated to around AD 820, preserved remarkable textile evidence and other equipment, showing how important textiles were in Viking society. And wool was not only used for clothing. Archaeological evidence also suggests wool was used for large Viking sails. Some surviving wool textiles were thick and treated with animal fat to improve their performance. That tells us something important. Viking communities were surrounded by wool technology, from clothing to sails to other textiles. Their environment gave them the raw material. Their skills turned it into protection. But there was another place that offered even better protection: the shore. When conditions allowed, a crew could bring the ship close to land. They could pull it onto a beach. Then everything changed. The crew could finally make a fire, cook food, dry clothing, repair the ship, and sleep on solid ground. The sea could take away comfort. Land could give it back. That is why Viking sailors did not simply fight the ocean continuously. They used the coastline whenever possible. They searched for safe places to stop. And their knowledge of the North Atlantic was built through generations of experience. They learned the winds, the currents, the dangerous coastlines, the safe landing places, and the seasons. Climate mattered enormously in the North Atlantic. Research shows that Viking age temperatures varied significantly between seasons, and colder conditions could make travel and survival much harder. So choosing when to sail could be just as important as knowing how to sail. And sometimes the smartest decision was simple: don't leave. Because the greatest Viking survival skill was knowing when the sea was too dangerous to challenge. But even the best preparation had limits. A storm could arrive. The wind could suddenly become violent. A sail could tear. A mast could break, and water could begin pouring into the hull. At that moment, warm clothing was no longer enough. The crew had to keep the ship alive. Someone steered. Someone handled the ropes. Someone controlled the sail. Others removed water. Everyone had a job, because on a small wooden vessel, one mistake could affect everyone. and falling into the sea was especially dangerous. Cold water removes body heat extremely quickly. Heavy clothing becomes soaked, movement becomes harder, and exhaustion arrives fast. So the safest place was always inside the ship. The Vikings also understood another important rule. Don't waste energy fighting a storm if you can avoid it. Their ships were designed for travel, but they were also designed to use the coastline. Viking sailors knew how to navigate using landmarks, the sun, stars, and observations of the natural world. That knowledge mattered. A skilled sailor might recognize dangerous water, a familiar coastline, a safer harbor, or a place where the ship could be pulled onto the beach. And when they reached land, everything changed. The crew could finally build a fire. Now they could dry wet clothing, warm themselves, prepare food, repair equipment, and sleep without the ocean moving beneath them. Fire was much more useful on land than aboard a wooden warship. An open flame surrounded by dry wood, ropes, sails, and a crowded crew was an obvious danger, so the beach became the safer heater. But staying warm also required fuel, and fuel came from food. A sailor working hard in cold weather was burning energy constantly, rowing, pulling ropes, steering, walking, carrying equipment. All of it produced heat. But that heat had to come from somewhere. Food. Viking communities had access to meat, fish, dairy, grains, and other foods. Archaeological evidence from places such as Burka shows cattle, pigs, sheep, poultry, and several kinds of fish were part of the food supply. On a voyage, food had to be practical. It needed to survive storage. It needed to provide energy. And it needed to take up as little space as possible. Fat was especially valuable. It contains a lot of energy in a small amount. That made fatty foods useful during hard physical work. But there was another problem. Water. A crew could survive cold for a while. They could not survive without drinking water. So fresh water had to be carried and replenished whenever possible. This is why stopping on land was so important. A landing could provide water, food, fire, dry ground, and rest. But Vikings could not always stop. Sometimes they had to remain at sea. And then the crew became the shelter. People sat close together. They shared whatever protection the ship provided. They worked in shifts. And they tried to keep their most important clothing and bedding dry. Because a dry wool cloak could be useful. A wet one could become a heavy burden. Archaeological evidence confirms that wool was a major material for Viking clothing, while cloaks, socks or leg coverings, leather footwear, and even waterproof skin garments were part of their clothing technology. So survival was never about one magical Viking invention. It was a chain of small decisions. Dress properly, eat enough, keep moving, protect your dry clothing, work together, watch the weather, and when the sea becomes too dangerous, find land. Because the Vikings didn't defeat the cold. They learned how to stay just ahead of it. So how did Vikings stay warm on freezing ships? The truth is, they didn't stay comfortably warm. They stayed warm enough to survive. There was no secret Viking heater, no magical northern blood, and no special immunity to the cold. Their survival came from many small decisions working together. Wool clothing, dry layers, good food, constant movement, shared warmth, careful navigation, and knowing when to leave the sea. Wool was especially important. Archaeological discoveries from Viking-age ships show just how important wool textiles were. The Oseberg and Gokstad finds preserved large amounts of thick wool material. Some of it was even treated with animal fat. And wool was not only for clothing, it was also used for sails. A large Viking sail could require an enormous amount of woven wool. That meant the same material helping people survive the cold was also helping their ships cross the ocean. But clothing was only one part of the system. The crew needed energy. They needed water. They needed dry equipment. And they needed rest. Most importantly, they needed experience. A skilled sailor knew that surviving the sea was not about fighting every storm. Sometimes you waited. Sometimes you turned around. Sometimes you searched for a sheltered harbor. And sometimes you pulled the ship onto a beach. Research into Viking-age seafaring suggests that sailors used networks of sheltered locations along important coastal routes. These places were more than convenient stops. They were part of the maritime system itself. This changed everything. Once ashore, there was fire, there was dry ground, there was a chance to cook, clothing could be dried, the ship could be repaired, and exhausted sailors could finally sleep. The sea was still dangerous, but humans had created a way to move through it, and climate mattered too. North Atlantic conditions were not always the same. Research shows that the Viking Age included periods of relatively favorable conditions for North Atlantic travel, while later cooling made travel and settlement more difficult. So the Vikings were not simply sailing into terrible weather whenever they wanted. They were reading the environment. They were choosing routes. They were using knowledge passed from one generation to another. And that knowledge could save lives. Think about the image we usually have of a Viking voyage. A warrior stands proudly at the front of the ship, wind in his hair, sword at his side, looking toward some distant land. It looks heroic, but the real story was probably much less glamorous. Someone was wet. Someone was exhausted. Someone was trying to keep his feet warm. Someone was bailing water. Someone was checking the sail. Someone was protecting the food. And someone was probably wondering, how much longer until we reach land? That is what makes Viking seafaring so impressive. They did not make the Northern Ocean safe. They learned how to survive inside an unsafe world. Their technology was not one invention. It was a system. The wool came from animals. The clothing came from skilled hands. The food came from farms, fishing, and preservation. The ship came from generations of boat building knowledge. The route came from generations of sailors. And survival came from everyone working together. So when you imagine a Viking ship crossing cold northern water, don't imagine fearless men who never felt the cold. Imagine ordinary humans, wet, tired, cold, but prepared, because the Vikings didn't conquer the ocean. They learned its rules. And sometimes that was enough to make it home.